The first thing my HOA did was tell my neighbors that my yard was causing a flooding problem. And the second thing they did was send me a warning saying I could be forced to pay for changes to my own property. The only problem was, my yard wasn't flooding anything. The water wasn't coming from my house. My landscaping wasn't damaged, and the evidence they were using to blame me didn't actually exist. But for a few weeks, I was the person everyone quietly looked at when they talked about that puddle on the sidewalk. I became the easiest person to blame, and that's how this whole mess started. I live in a small neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates, a quiet little cul-de-sac outside Mesa Ridge, where every house seems to follow the same pattern. Beige stucco walls, neat front lawns, trimmed bushes, and sidewalks that curve perfectly between the homes. From the outside, it looks like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens, the kind of neighborhood people move into because they want peace and routine. But anyone who has ever lived under an HOA knows that sometimes the smallest things can become surprisingly complicated. A trash can left out too long, a mailbox painted the wrong color, a flower bed that doesn't match the neighborhood style. Somehow there's always a rule waiting somewhere. My house was nothing special compared to the bigger homes around me, but it was special to me. My front yard was simple. I had zoysia grass, 2 old crepit myrtle trees near the walkway, and a stone border that my grandfather built with his own hands back in 1994. Those stones weren't expensive. They weren't some designer landscaping feature. They were just old pieces of rock placed carefully around a garden bed by a man who believed a home should show a little bit of the people who lived there. I still remember watching him build it when I was younger, kneeling in the dirt with his work gloves on, moving each stone around until he was happy with the way it looked. He told me something I never forgot. He said, "A good home isn't made by what people see from the street. It's made by the memories you leave behind." For almost 30 years, that yard had been the same. Rain came, water moved downhill, and everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The slope carried runoff away from the house and toward the street drain. No standing water, no complaints, no issues. Then one cool morning in October, I opened my mailbox and found a cream-colored envelope sitting inside. It had the Willow Creek Estates HOA logo stamped on the front in dark blue ink. And I remember immediately thinking, well, that's probably not going to be good news. Nobody opens an HOA letter expecting a surprise gift. Usually, it is either a reminder, a violation notice, or some carefully worded message that somehow ends with you spending money. I opened it while standing in my driveway, expecting something small, maybe a reminder about trimming a branch or fixing something minor. Instead, I read that my property had been identified as the source of excessive runoff that was creating a public safety issue on the sidewalk. According to the letter, water from my yard was allegedly flowing onto the walkway after storms and creating a slipping hazard. They warned me that if I didn't correct the drainage problem, the HOA could require landscaping modifications at my expense. I just stood there holding that paper, looking from the letter to my yard, then back at the letter again. I honestly thought I had missed a page. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Because I knew my yard. I knew every corner of it. I knew how water moved across it because I had watched storms come through that property for years. So I kept asking myself the same question. How did they decide this was my fault? Did someone inspect the slope? Did they measure the elevation? Did they check the drainage plans? Or did someone simply see water near my house and decide the closest yard must be responsible? A few days later, another storm rolled through, and I decided I was going to see the situation with my own eyes. After the rain stopped, I walked outside. The air smelled like wet clay and fresh rain, that clean smell that makes a neighborhood feel completely different for a few minutes. I crouched near the curb and watched the water move, and immediately, I noticed something that didn't match the HOA's story. The water from my yard was not moving toward the sidewalk. It was flowing downhill toward the street drain exactly like it always had. I could hear it running through the grates. Everything was working normally. But about 10 feet north, closer to the sidewalk, there was a puddle sitting under the streetlight. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a pizza pan, but it was clearly trapped there. It wasn't coming from my property. It wasn't crossing my yard. It was simply collecting because the concrete underneath it wasn't draining properly. That's when I realized something important. They weren't looking for the cause. They were looking for someone to blame. I emailed the HOA board and asked a simple question. I asked them how they determined that the water was coming from my property. I asked if they had measurements, a survey, or any kind of drainage report. I wasn't trying to start a war. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I just wanted facts. The response came the next day. It said the water was visibly moving toward the walkway after rainfall. That was the entire explanation. No engineer, no measurements, no inspection report, just an opinion based on what someone saw for a few minutes after a storm. And that's when I realized I had a choice. I could accept their decision, pay whatever they demanded, and change my yard to fix a problem that wasn't mine. Or I could find out the truth. I decided I wasn't going to fight them with emotion. I was going to fight them with evidence. I knew arguing with the HOA board based on what I could see from my own eyes wasn't going to be enough. The problem with organizations like that is once a decision gets written down, it suddenly feels more official than it actually is. A sentence on a letterhead can make an assumption look like a fact. So instead of sending another angry email or standing in front of the board trying to convince them that I was right, I decided to do something different. I hired someone who didn't care about neighborhood politics, personal opinions, or who had lived there longer than who. I hired a licensed civil engineer named Mark Ellison. When Mark arrived at my house, he didn't come with a lot of dramatic opinions or a speech prepared. He showed up with a laser level, an elevation rod, a clipboard, and the kind of calm confidence you only see in someone who has spent years solving problems that other people argue about. He walked around my yard quietly for a few minutes, looking at the slope, the curb, the sidewalk, and the street drain. Then he looked at me and said, "Before we decide what the problem is, let's figure out what the ground is actually doing." And honestly, that sentence alone made me feel better because that was exactly what I felt had been missing from the beginning. Nobody had actually checked. They had just assumed. For the next 2 hours, Mark measured everything. He took elevation readings from the corner of my driveway to the edge of the sidewalk. He checked the grade near the stone border my grandfather built. He followed the natural path of the water after another small rainfall. Every number went onto his clipboard. Every measurement had a purpose. There was something strangely satisfying about watching someone replace opinions with facts. It felt like watching a detective slowly piece together a mystery, except the suspect wasn't a person. It was a half-inch difference in concrete. After finishing his measurements, Mark told me he wanted to compare them with the original grading plans for the neighborhood. At first, I didn't even know those existed. Apparently, when the community was built more than 2 decades earlier, the county had approved detailed plans showing how each lot was supposed to drain. Mark spent the next few days pulling those records from the county archive. When he finally called me back, his voice had that tone people use when they already know the answer but want to explain it carefully. He said, "Your property isn't the issue. The original grading is actually doing exactly what it was designed to do." I remember sitting there quietly for a second because I had expected some complicated explanation, maybe something about landscaping mistakes or old pipes or something expensive that I would somehow have to fix. Instead, the answer was much simpler. My yard was innocent. The sidewalk was the problem. Mark explained that over the years, one section of the concrete had settled lower than the surrounding areas. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some giant crack that everyone would notice walking by. It was only about half an inch. But that tiny dip was enough to trap water during storms. The water wasn't coming from my property. It was collecting because the sidewalk itself had slowly changed shape over time. And then Mark found something even more interesting. The HOA's own maintenance records showed that they had known about sidewalk leveling issues for years. They had discussed repairs multiple times but delayed them because of budget concerns. 5 years of postponed maintenance had created the exact problem they were now blaming on me. That discovery changed everything. At first, I was mostly frustrated because I felt unfairly accused. But after seeing those records, I started feeling something different. I wasn't just dealing with a mistake anymore. I was dealing with a system that had chosen the easiest target instead of the correct solution. My house was right there. My yard was visible. My landscaping was something they could point at. The sidewalk, on the other hand, was the HOA's responsibility, and admitting that meant admitting they had ignored their own maintenance problem. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into the HOA meeting carrying a folder. Inside were Mark's engineering report, the elevation maps, the original county grading plans, and the maintenance records. The room looked exactly how I expected. A long table, a few board members sitting behind it, and that uncomfortable silence that happens when everyone knows a disagreement is about to begin. The HOA president, Linda Parker, looked at me and said, "We hope you understand that this process is about protecting the community, not targeting individual homeowners." I almost laughed because I had heard versions of that sentence before. It was the kind of statement that sounded reasonable until you remembered who had received the violation notice. I placed the report on the table and said, "I completely agree. Protecting the community is exactly why we need to look at the actual cause of the problem." Then Mark stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack anyone. He simply explained the measurements. He showed the board where the water flowed, where it stopped, and why the sidewalk settlement was responsible for the standing water. He pointed to the elevation map and said, "The drainage pattern from the property is moving away from the walkway. The ponding is caused by the depressed section of concrete, not by runoff from the homeowner's lot." And that was the moment the entire room changed. The confidence disappeared. The questions stopped. The board members who had been so certain weeks earlier suddenly started looking down at their papers. Because numbers are difficult to argue with, a person can be accused of exaggerating. A homeowner can be called defensive. But measurements don't get emotional. They don't take sides. They just show what is there. After a few minutes of discussion, the board made its decision. The violation was dismissed immediately, but they didn't stop there. The HOA was ordered to schedule sidewalk repairs and create a new procedure requiring proper drainage verification before issuing future runoff violations. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like I could breathe again. Not because I had won some battle against the HOA, but because the truth had finally been allowed into the room. 2 months later, I watched a repair crew pull up in front of my house, and I remember standing there with my arms crossed, just listening to the sound of concrete being cut and tools moving across the sidewalk. It was a strange feeling because, in a way, this was the moment I had been fighting for. But it also wasn't the kind of victory people imagine when they hear a story like this. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no moment where someone slammed their hand on the table and admitted they were wrong. Real life usually isn't like that. Most of the time, accountability shows up quietly, with a work truck parked outside and a crew fixing something that should have been fixed a long time ago. And honestly, that was enough for me. I never wanted the HOA to fail. I never wanted my neighbors to pick sides. I never wanted to be the person everyone whispered about at the mailbox. I just wanted the truth to matter more than an assumption. The workers removed the uneven sections of concrete, corrected the low area where water had been collecting, and rebuilt the sidewalk so the drainage worked the way it was supposed to. Watching them fix it was almost frustrating because the solution was so simple. The entire conflict, all the letters, the accusations, the meetings, the stress between neighbors. It all came down to a small section of concrete that had slowly settled over time. A repair that probably could have been handled years earlier became a battle because the wrong person was blamed. After the work was finished, I waited for the next storm. Maybe that sounds strange, but after spending weeks being told that my yard was the problem, I wanted to see it for myself. When the rain finally came, I stood under my porch and watched the water move across the yard. The drops hit the grass, rolled down the natural slope, passed by the stone border my grandfather built, and continued toward the street exactly like they always had. Then I looked toward the sidewalk. The puddle was gone. The water moved freely toward the drain. no longer trapped in that sunken section of concrete. It was almost funny because the yard everyone had pointed at as the problem hadn't changed at all. Not one blade of grass had been replaced. Not one tree had been removed. Not one stone had been moved. The only thing that changed was that someone finally fixed the thing that was actually broken. The neighborhood slowly moved on after that. But things were never quite the same. Some neighbors who had stayed quiet during the dispute started stopping by and asking questions. A few admitted they had wondered why the HOA blamed me so quickly. One neighbor named Tom told me, I thought something about that notice felt wrong. They didn't ask what happened. They just decided who was responsible. And that sentence stuck with me because that was exactly what had happened. The problem wasn't just a puddle. The problem was the process. The HOA had skipped the most important step in solving any problem, finding out what was actually happening. The strange thing about being accused of something you didn't do is that at first, you want to defend yourself because you feel attacked. But after a while, you start realizing it's bigger than just your own situation. You start thinking about all the other homeowners who might have received a similar letter and simply paid because they didn't have the time, money, or energy to fight back. Maybe someone else had replaced perfectly good landscaping because they were told it was causing a problem. Maybe someone else had paid a fine because they assumed the HOA must know what they were talking about. That thought bothered me more than the original accusation, because a community only works when people trust that decisions are being made fairly. Rules are important. Maintenance is important. Standards are important. But none of those things matter if people use them without honesty. A rule should never become a shortcut for avoiding responsibility. Looking back now, I don't think the HOA was made up of villains. I don't think every board member woke up wanting to punish homeowners. Most people involved probably believed they were doing the right thing. But good intentions don't replace good investigation. A person can be sincere and still be wrong. A group can have authority and still make a mistake. The difference is what happens after the mistake is discovered. Do they admit it? Do they correct it? Or do they protect their pride and keep searching for someone else to blame? For me, the biggest lesson wasn't about drainage or sidewalks. It was about standing up calmly when something doesn't feel right. I could have ignored the letter. I could have paid the fine. I could have changed my yard just to make the problem disappear. And maybe that would have been easier in the short term. But sometimes the easy option creates a bigger problem later because silence can look like agreement. My grandfather built that stone border almost 30 years ago. And when I looked at it after everything was over, I realized I wasn't just protecting a piece of landscaping. I was protecting the idea that people deserve to be treated fairly before they are judged. In the end, the HOA repaired the sidewalk, changed their process, and learned that assumptions can be expensive. My yard stayed exactly the same. The trees my grandfather planted continued growing. The stones he placed remained where they had always been. And the thing I remember most isn't the argument, the paperwork, or the meeting. It's the quiet moment after the first storm when I watched the water finally flow the right way. Because sometimes winning isn't about proving someone wrong. Sometimes winning is simply making sure the truth gets a chance to be heard. But now I want to hear what you think. Do you believe the HOA made an honest mistake that got out of control? Or do you think they were wrong for blaming a homeowner before they had real evidence? If you were in my position, would you have fought back with an engineer and official reports? Or would you have paid the fine just to keep the peace? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, because these situations are never just about a sidewalk or a puddle. They are about fairness, responsibility, and how much power a community organization should have over the people who live there. And if you've ever dealt with a situation where someone blamed you before they knew the facts, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the smallest neighborhood disputes reveal the biggest truths about how we treat each other.